We're now going to move on to some exercises. You can either do these here during the gala, and I will indicate a good place to pause, or you can just carry on watching continuously and do the exercises later. In order to do these, you will need a piece of paper and a pen, or a Word document or other kind of word processing software open. So, for this exercise, you need to get your piece of paper or your Word document, and you want to write news in the middle. And then you want to take a couple of minutes to just write the first thing that comes to mind when you think of news. Now, this can be specific news stories, like the examples I've given. It can be particular news personalities or channels, or, so it could be like, Fox News or BBC News. Or it could even be a phrase or a quote, or even a meme, just anything that comes to mind when you think of news. Write it down, even if it seems unusual. You might be able to find a way to work with it later. So if you are kind of following along with this exercise now, this is a good place to pause. Now you have your piece of paper and you have a mind map. And so all those things you wrote around the outside, the idea of this exercise is to see if you can kind of pull some of them together to come up with a story. So some examples of mine was I had old news, I had fake news, and I had phrases like no news is good news and the bearer of bad news. So how might I perhaps take those and turn them into a story? Well, one potential way is I could combine old news and fake news, and I could write a story about a celebrity who's fallen out of favour, fallen into obscurity. And so they decide to create some fake news. Let's say that they tell everyone they have cancer, in the hopes of making people feel sorry about them and to get people talking about them. And so the story would be exploring the theme of news, because it would be looking at the ways in which people use news to manipulate other people. And of course, with an option like fake news, there are certainly lots of other ways that you can look at that too. So that's one example of pulling a couple of items together to make a story. You can tack more than 3 things together if you feel that makes a story, so you can have 3 or 4. I don't recommend pulling too many together, because the word limit is 2,000 words, and you don't want your story to feel too jumbled. But again, it depends entirely on what you've written. It may be that you combine more and it would still kind of work within the story. So have a play around with those, see what kinds of stories come up. And of course, you will most likely find that you will constantly be adding to it. So you will think of something else, maybe you'll be in the shower or something, or out doing your grocery shopping, and something else will come to mind and you can add it. And you may even find that some of the things you write around the outside will start having little bits branching off those as well, and that is completely fine. But it will serve as a sort of hub for you to start pulling ideas out. But if you are still struggling with that, I am going to go through a second exercise, which you can either use sort of in tandem with this, you can combine it, or it can be used on its own as well. So let's go and do that. Okay, so for our second activity, you are going to need a new piece of paper or a new page on your Word document, and you're going to have 2 columns. So on the first column, you want to write down any types of news that you can think of. So this can be anything to like weather, sports, or even things like births, deaths, exam results, getting a new job, anything. It doesn't have to be big news, just any kind of news that a person can receive on a personal level or a more worldwide one. And then in the other column, you want to spend a couple of minutes just writing down as many methods for conveying news as you can think of. And I would also kind of urge you to, if you think of any unusual ways, to jot those down as well. So this can be things like, messages in bottles or smoke signals, if it could be used to convey news, even if that news is not normally conveyed that way, write it down. So we're going to take a couple of minutes to do that. If you are following along with this, this is a good place to pause and we will come back. So, now that you have your 2 columns, there are a couple of things that you can do with this. The first is you need to look at methods of news, so methods of transmitting it. And you need to see if there are any examples that stand out to you, something that you think, a story jumps out. So a couple of examples that jumped out for me when I wrote mine were letters and telegrams. And the reason they stood out to me is because when it came to letters, it made me think of the days before telephones, and it was the only way for families and friends who didn't live close by to stay in contact and receive news about each other. And so people would spend the entire week, drafting a letter with all the news of the week, and then send another one, but then something sudden might come up and they'll send another one, and sometimes those letters would kind of cross over in the post, and things like that. So that was the thing that stood out to me for that. And then when it came to telegrams, it made me think that during World War I and World War II, this was the way that they informed people, households that a loved one had died on the front. And so these telegrams would start with the phrase, "We regret to inform you." And of course, they would be delivered to the house of the soldier who had died. And so what would happen is, if an unfamiliar soldier was sort of walking up the road or a street, everyone would kind of look out their windows, kind of waiting to see which house he went into, because that house was about to get some very, very bad news. So those are a couple of examples. Another fun activity that you can do is you can look at your column of types of news and methods of news and see if anything kind of jumps out to you then, especially if you can tie in one type of news with a really sort of unconventional way of telling it, much like the billboard. So those are ways that you can use it on its own, but you can also start to combine them with the mind map we did in the previous exercise. So it might be that I combine my old news and my fake news and combine it with social media, say, for example, or anything else. So hopefully those exercises should help you to start to pull some ideas together. Don't worry if you don't come up with any ideas straight away. Maybe you have to sleep on it for a couple of days and have a think, and then an idea will hit you. But if it doesn't, I'm going to go through a few more sort of general tips that might help.